Welcome to Fact Fragment. I'm your AI host, and I've been specifically chosen by the Fact Fragment team for my clarity, precision, and hopefully engaging delivery as we dig into some complex topics.
And I'm here to bring in some expert perspective. Today, we're exploring that really intricate relationship between our minds and our brains. We'll be drawing from neuroscience, psychology, and even philosophy.
Exactly. Today, we're diving deep into a question it's fascinated people for literally ages.
Right.
How are the mind and brain connected? We've pulled together research covering centuries, from old historical ideas right up to the latest brain scans and philosophical arguments.
It's a huge question.
It really is. And our goal here is to unpack some, frankly, surprising evidence that pushes back against that simple idea that the mind is just what the brain does. We want to explore some alternative ways of thinking that might just shift how you see things.
Absolutely. And as our sources show, this isn't a new debate at all. You go back millennia, you've got thinkers like Hippocrates and Galen already suggesting, some link between the brain and how we behave or think.
Right. Very early days, obviously. But it was the start, the beginning of thinking mental stuff might be physical, based in the brain.
Then, much later, 17th century, Descartes really framed the mind-body problem. And then in the 18th and 19th centuries, you get things like phrenology.
Ah, yes, phrenology, which, okay, we know now was incorrect about the skull bumps meaning specific things.
Definitely incorrect, yes.
But it was still an attempt, wasn't it, to link brain features to mental traits. Kind of influential in its own way, pushing the idea of localization.
And that localization idea got serious traction in the mid-19th century. Broca and Wernicke, their work was truly groundbreaking.
Finding those specific brain areas linked to speech. Broca is for producing speech, Wernicke's for understanding it.
Yeah, by studying patients with brain damage in those specific spots, that was solid evidence that different parts of the brain do different jobs.
And around the same time, late 1800s, you have Ramon y Cajal, his neuron doctrine.
Crucial, the idea that the brain is made of individual cells, neurons,
Yeah.
that gave us the sort of cellular foundation for how the brain works, how it processes information.
And while all this neuroscience was happening, psychology was also starting up as its own science. Wundt's lab in 1879.
Often cited as the beginning, yeah. Early psychology was focused on things like introspection, reaction times, different schools of thought battling it out, like structuralism versus functionalism.
We should also mention Freud, early 20th century, bringing in the idea of the unconscious mind. Although, questions about its scientific rigor came later.
True. And then a really big shift happened mid-20th century, the cognitive revolution.
Right, moving away from just looking at behavior, like behaviorism did, and starting to think about the mind as, well, almost like an information processor, a computer in a way.
Exactly. And that thinking really set the stage for modern cognitive neuroscience, bringing psychology and brain science together.
And the technology just exploded from there, didn't it? Late 20th century, you get EEG, MEG, measuring electrical and magnetic fields.
And then fMRI in the 90s. Functional MRI. That was a game changer, letting us see brain activity in living people non-invasively.
And it keeps going. This century, we've got the Human Connectome Project trying to map all the brain's wiring, super detailed microscopy, optogenetics.
Optogenetics is amazing, controlling specific neurons with light. Incredible tools.
So with all this history, all these incredible tools showing us the brain in action, it's maybe not surprising that the main view today, especially in neuroscience, is physicalism.
Right. The idea that the mind is fundamentally a physical process. It's what the brain does. There was even a survey of philosophers mentioned in our sources, something like 52% identified as physicalists.
Which leads directly to what's often called the identity theory in philosophy, mental states or brain states. Simple as that.
Well, simple on the surface, maybe. But this is where it gets tricky, and where some of the challenges start to pop up, even from within neuroscience.
Like the hard problem of consciousness.
Exactly. David Chalmers coined that term. How does all that physical stuff, the neurons firing, the chemicals, actually give rise to subjective experience? The feeling of what it's like to see red or feel pain, qualia, as they're called.
How does the physical become the subjective? That's the mystery.
And the identity theory basically says those qualia are just the physical brain states. But some philosophers and even some scientists argue that maybe subjective experience, maybe free will, our sense of self. Maybe these things resist that strict reduction.
Our sources mention things like emergentism.
Right, where consciousness arises from brain complexity but isn't just the sum of its parts. Or dual aspect theories, where mind and brain are like two sides of the same coin, different aspects of one underlying reality.
What's really interesting, though, is how the neuroscientific findings themselves are starting to muddy the waters for that simple identity theory.
Absolutely. For instance, the search for a single seed of consciousness in the brain hasn't really panned out, has it?
No. People looked at areas like the claustrum, that thin sheet of neurons deep inside.
And initially thought, maybe this is it. But it looks more like it's involved in coordinating information flow, not generating consciousness itself.
And it's striking when you realize just how much brain activity is unconscious. All the background processing, sensory filtering, motor control, most of it happens without us being aware.
So what makes some neural activity conscious, while most isn't? That's a huge question right there.
And looking at specific brain structures adds more puzzles, like the cerebellum.
Yeah, the cerebellum is massive, tons of neurons, critical for motor control, balance, but damaging it. Doesn't typically knock out consciousness.
People have motor problems, coordination issues, but they're still aware.
Yeah, and there are even those incredibly rare cases of people born without a cerebellar genesis. They have challenges, for sure, but generally intact consciousness.
Then there are spinal cord injuries, terrible paralysis, loss of sensation below the injury. But the person's consciousness, their sense of self, isn't altered.
Doesn't seem to reside in the spinal cord either, then. What about the thalamus? Often called a relay station, and it definitely plays a role.
Right, stimulating the thalamus can sometimes arouse someone from anesthesia. But does that mean it's the generator of consciousness?
Our sources urge caution there. Correlation isn't causation. It might be more like a gatekeeper, modulating the flow of information that allows for consciousness, rather than being the source itself.
The whole anesthesia thing is fascinating, too. We assume it's just lights out, complete unconsciousness.
But can we be sure? Maybe it's a conscious state, just one where you can't report it or form memories. Think about twilight anesthesia.
Where patients respond during a procedure but don't remember it later.
Exactly. They were clearly conscious on some level. And there's evidence suggesting awareness in other seemingly unresponsive states to sleepwalking, hypnosis, maybe even some vegetative states. Just because someone can't respond doesn't automatically mean there's no inner experience.
Okay, let's shift to something really counterintuitive. Split brain studies.
Yes. Cutting the corpus callosum, that massive cable connecting the two brain hemispheres, usually done for severe epilepsy.
And you'd think that would split consciousness, right? Two separate minds in one head.
That was the initial thought, maybe. But surprisingly, no. The patients still feel like one unified person.
There are those odd effects like the alien hand syndrome, where one hand seems to do its own thing.
Which is bizarre, definitely. But it's not like having a split personality. They still identify as a single self. And newer research is even questioning some classic interpretations, finding maybe more integration than we thought.
And even more dramatic is hemispherectomy, removing an entire half of the brain.
Often done in childhood for severe seizures or other conditions. And it's astonishing people can live relatively normal lives with just one hemisphere.
Our sources mention language functions sometimes migrating to the remaining hemisphere, even visual fields reorganizing.
There might be some subtle deficits. Yeah, maybe in recognizing words or faces quickly. But the core sense of a unified consciousness, it seems to remain intact. It really makes you question how much brain is actually necessary.
Which leads to that hydrocephalus case mentioned in the sources.
Oh, that one's extraordinary. An individual whose brain volume was reduced by, 50 to 75% due to fluid buildup.
Yet lived a normal life, job, family, slightly lower IQ, but functional. Sheer brain size clearly isn't the whole story.
Not at all. And then you have the congenitally decorticate children, born with little or no cerebral cortex, the part we usually associate with higher thought.
Traditionally, the assumption was zero awareness.
But with dedicated care, some showed, well, signs of awareness, responding to sounds, tracking objects, recognizing faces, maybe even self-recognition.
That seriously challenges the idea that the cortex is the only thing that generates consciousness.
Some might argue it's just brainstem activity, but can the brainstem's basic functions really produce subjective experience? It's a leap. And stepping back, even looking at brain size across species.
Right. More neurons doesn't automatically mean smarter. Elephants have more than us. And basic brain connectivity patterns are surprisingly similar across mammals.
It all chips away at that simple mind equals brain matter idea.
Okay, so consciousness is complex. What about memory? That's another core mental function,
And again, it doesn't seem to live in just one place, distributed throughout the brain.
which fits with the hemispherectomy cases, right? Removing half the brain doesn't necessarily wipe out half the memories, especially in kids.
Exactly. And then there's weirder stuff, those planaria experiments. Flatworms retaining learned behaviors even after regenerating a whole new head and brain.
That's wild. It hints memory might not be solely brain-based somehow.
There was also research on RNA transfer suggesting a molecular basis, but the timing is tricky. Protein synthesis seems too slow for the instant recall we often have.
And what about the main theory, that memories are stored in the connections between neurons, the synapses?
The synaptic trace theory. It faces challenges too. Brain tissue turns over constantly, synapses change. How do they reliably store memories for decades? It's a puzzle.
Even the focus on enneagram cells, the specific neurons active during memory formation.
Is maybe too simplistic. Reactivating those cells makes mice freeze, sure. But does that mean they're reliving the memory or just having an emotional response or reacting to a stimulus cue?
Freezing can be triggered by activating lots of different brain areas, apparently.
It's that correlation versus causation trap again. Seeing activity alongside memory doesn't prove the memory is that activity stored right there.
So, challenges for consciousness, challenges for memory, and now what about cognition in things without brains?
Right, the field of basal cognition. This is fascinating stuff, looking at plants, single-celled organisms.
And finding cognitive abilities.
Seems like it. Climbing plants that seem to anticipate where supports will be. Roots integrating complex environmental data. Amoebae learning conditioned responses.
And slime molds, those giant single cells.
Solving mazes. Optimizing networks. Showing habituation. It's been called proto-intelligence.
Even bacteria in colonies seem to communicate and solve problems together.
It really forces you to ask, what is cognition? Do you absolutely need a nervous system for information processing and basic decision-making?
If these simple organisms show basic cognition without neurons, what does that mean for the mind-brain identity theory?
It's a big challenge. Our sources suggest this opens the door to thinking differently. Maybe mind and consciousness are more fundamental. Maybe the brain isn't the generator, but more like a receiver, an interface.
A transmissive system, allowing a pre-existing consciousness to interact with the physical world.
That's one way to conceptualize it. It echoes older ideas like William James's filter theory, the brain as a reducing valve for a wider consciousness. Some Eastern philosophies have similar views too.
And thinking about it that way, well, it makes some of those puzzling findings less puzzling, perhaps.
Potentially. Intact consciousness after losing half a brain. Maybe the fundamental consciousness is just manifesting through a reduced instrument. It offers a different kind of explanation.
Our sources propose this idea of a post-material psychology, one that doesn't just assume mind equals brain from the outset.
Yeah, keeping an open mind, scientifically. Exploring non-physicalist ideas, because the purely physicalist ones are running into some tricky explanatory hurdles with this evidence.
It's noted that materialist views often need multiple, specific, sometimes complex explanations for each anomaly.
Whereas a non-physicalist viewpoint might offer a more unified, maybe even simpler framework for understanding these diverse findings, though obviously much more research is needed.
So, wrapping up this deep dive, it seems pretty clear the mind-brain relationship is, well, still deeply mysterious. It's not a simple equation.
Not at all. The neuroscience is incredible, giving us amazing insights,
Yeah.
but it's also throwing up these profound challenges to that standard physicalist view.
Which leaves us, and you listening, with a big question to ponder.
How does all this evidence maybe shift your understanding of consciousness, of who you are, of reality itself? What new questions does it spark for you?
Thank you for joining us for this exploration here at Fact Fragment. If this got you thinking, please do consider liking and subscribing. That way you won't miss our future deep dives.
And if you're interested in digging into the research yourself, you can request the papers we discussed via the link on our website.
Until next time, keep questioning, keep exploring.